What if the person who once held your dreams in their hands was the same one who tore them apart? At 68, sitting on my porch, I've had the time to ask myself that very question more than once. Time, I've learned, doesn't just slip by. It settles like dust in forgotten corners, gathering layers of pain, triumph, regret, and decisions that defined who I became. I look at the wrinkles on my hands, each line telling a story, some of survival, others of dreams I thought I'd lost forever. This arm of mine, still aching when the wind shifts, is a constant reminder of the man I once called my husband, and the forest that took him from me. It was the night that changed everything. But sometimes the darkest secrets are the ones we hide from the world, and the ones we bury deep inside ourselves. So if you're watching, baby, go ahead and like this video, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story. 'Cause this ain't just my story, it's the story of too many women who had to smile through the silence. It feels like just yesterday when I was a young girl in rural Ohio, full of hope and dreams. In 1973, I was only 16, living in a world where everything seemed either too big or too small, depending on the day. Back then, my town was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. The local diner was more famous than the fast food chains that dotted the rest of the country. People didn't lock their doors at night, and gossip traveled faster than any car could go. It was a town where everyone had a place and a story, even if they didn't always tell the truth about it. My own story started as many do, quietly. I worked as a maid for a family of doctors. Their house was big, huge by my standards. It was the kind of place you only read about in magazines or saw in TV shows. I slept in a small, barely furnished room at the back of the house, with only a thin mattress and the smell of bleach and pine to keep me company. My days were long and hard, waking up before dawn, cleaning the house, washing dishes, folding laundry. But there was a certain comfort in the rhythm of it. I earned a meager wage, but I saved every penny I could, hiding it under the mattress. I had big plans for that money. I dreamed of buying a sewing machine one day and opening my own little studio. I told myself that one day, I'd be someone. Maybe I'd sew wedding dresses or design costumes for theater productions. In a small town like mine, a dream like that was as far-fetched as it got. Mrs. Reynolds, my boss, was a kind woman as far as bosses go. She treated me better than most. She even took me to get my ID when I turned 16. She said, "Every young lady needs her documents," and I didn't question it. Little did I know, that card would become my most valuable possession when I eventually ran away from there. I had no idea what life had in store for me when I met Reggie. It happened at one of the few events in town where the old and the young came together, the community block party. Back then, parties were more innocent affairs. The whole town would show up. There was food, dancing, and families together under the string lights. But it was that night, that party, where I first saw him. He stood against the fence like he owned the world, tall, muscular, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and polished shoes. He was 28, much older than me, but the way he looked at me made me feel like I was the only person in the room. He asked me if I wanted a drink. I was a country girl who had never touched alcohol, but I accepted anyway, not wanting to seem rude. Reggie had that magnetic charm, the kind of charisma that made you forget everything around you. He introduced himself as a salesman, and for the next few months, he kept showing up in town, always well-dressed, always with money to spend. He took me to restaurants I had never heard of. I started skipping work, sneaking away to see him whenever he was in town. My boss noticed, of course, and she wasn't pleased. But I didn't care. I was in love, or at least I thought I was. I was a 16-year-old girl, drunk on the attention, drunk on the fantasy of a life I had never known. It didn't take long before things escalated. A few months into our relationship, I found myself pregnant. I was 16 and knew nothing about life, certainly nothing about how quickly the consequences of one night could change everything. When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. I thought the world was closing in on me. I was still a maid in Mrs. Reynolds' house, and I knew that a maid couldn't afford to be pregnant. I couldn't even tell my parents. I couldn't imagine the look on their faces. When I called Reggie, I was shaking. I didn't think he would answer, but he did. And to my surprise, he didn't vanish like I thought he would. He laughed on the other end of the line. "So what? I was planning to take you to the city anyway," he said. "Now I have a reason." 2 days later, he arrived at the back door of Mrs. Reynolds' house with his yellow Chevy Nova. He threw my clothes in the trunk without a second thought, and we left for Baltimore. It was the kind of reckless decision you make when you're 16, caught between the excitement of adventure and the terror of the unknown. That yellow Chevy wasn't exactly the car I had dreamed of driving, but it got me away. I didn't even look back when we left. The life I was leaving behind, the cleaning, the long hours, the small room in the back of the house, suddenly felt small and insignificant. I thought I was stepping into something bigger, something better. Little did I know that the life I was about to enter would change me forever. The first few months in Baltimore were a whirlwind of newness. Reggie kept up the charade of being my savior, and I, like a young girl under a spell, let him. The shack he called a home near the waterfront was a far cry from the grand house he had promised me, but I was too smitten to notice the discrepancies. It was small, dark, and barely functional, but for me, it was still a step up from the backroom I had lived in for so long. I had a bed that was mine, a roof that didn't leak, at least not too badly, and a man who promised me everything. The world outside seemed unfamiliar. The city was a place of flashing lights and endless noise. Reggie would take me out to clubs, buying drinks and expensive dinners, all while regaling me with tales of his adventures. He would talk about the places he'd traveled, the people he'd met, the fortune he was building. His words were like magic, weaving a narrative of success and grandeur, making me believe that with him, anything was possible. For a girl from the sticks, it was intoxicating. I had never experienced anything like it. Reggie's stories became our reality, but something about the situation never felt quite right. The house he had promised near the water wasn't near water at all. It was a run-down 2-room shack perched precariously on a hill in a neighborhood that had seen better days. There were cracks in the walls and a faint smell of mold in the air, but I pushed it all to the back of my mind. After all, I wasn't here for a mansion. I was here for him. And I was in love. Or so I thought. One evening, after a particularly late night out, I asked Reggie about the house. I had assumed he would fix it up soon, perhaps in time for a bigger celebration, a party where we could invite the people he spoke so highly of. Instead, his mood shifted. His face darkened, and he became defensive. "What are you, a damn architect now?" he spat, anger flashing in his eyes. "Don't ask questions about things you don't understand." That was the first time I saw the crack in his charming facade. I tried to ignore it. Love is supposed to make you blind, right? We were married by the end of the summer. It wasn't a grand ceremony, just a quick trip to the courthouse, a couple of signatures, and a rushed promise. I was only 17, but I lied on the certificate, claiming I was 18 to avoid any complications with my parents. They didn't know where I was, what I was doing, or who I was doing it with. I hadn't spoken to them since I left for Baltimore, and I wasn't about to start now. Life in the shack wasn't what I had imagined. It was rough. Reggie would leave for days at a time, his business trips growing longer and more frequent. He came back smelling of cheap perfume, his hands trembling with a nervous energy I couldn't understand. When I asked where he was going, his answer was always vague. Work, he'd say, or you wouldn't understand. And every time I questioned him, I'd get the same reaction, anger, followed by an apology and flowers. I told myself that this was part of love, the way relationships worked. At least, that's what I convinced myself. He was just stressed, he said. It was the nature of his job, and I believed it. But one night, after a particularly long silence between us, I found something that broke the illusion for good. I had been cleaning up around the house when I stumbled across something strange hidden behind one of the old cabinets. It wasn't much at first, just a bundle of cash stuffed into a bag. I didn't think much of it, but the sight of it made me uneasy. Reggie wasn't exactly wealthy, and he had never mentioned having this much money. I could hear the faint sound of his footsteps as he came back into the room, but he didn't say anything when he saw me holding the cash. His eyes went cold, and I could see a hint of fear in them, something I hadn't seen before. He walked over slowly, his hand reaching out for the bag, and in that moment, everything changed. I could feel the weight of the secret between us, thick in the air. "Put that down," he said, his voice tight. "It's nothing." But I could feel it, the danger. The question in the pit of my stomach. What kind of nothing was worth this much cash? "That's not all," he muttered, looking around nervously. He gestured toward a large plaster eagle perched on the shelf. "You know what that thing is, right?" He gave a hollow laugh. "It's a protector." My heart sank. Reggie's casual mention of the eagle sparked something inside me. I had always noticed it there, its eyes cold and unblinking, but I had never thought twice about it. Reggie went to the eagle, as if it were part of a routine, and carefully turned it. He reached into the hollow space in its base, and when his hand emerged, it was full of cash. Wads of it, stacked together like a fortress. And then he took out something else, a small, gleaming revolver. I had no words. I simply stared. "Don't ever ask about that again," he said sharply, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You don't want to know." At that moment, the illusion shattered. The man I had married, the man I had thought would lead me to something better, wasn't who I thought he was. He wasn't the charming salesman or the knight in shining armor. He was a liar, a man who had brought me into a world I didn't understand and couldn't escape. Reggie was a drug dealer. The truth settled into my bones, cold and heavy. This was not the life I had imagined. And yet, there was no way out. Not then. Not yet. I had no family, no money, and certainly no way to survive without him. I couldn't leave. Not yet. But in the silence of that room, with the plaster eagle staring back at me and the cash burning through my fingers, I knew something I hadn't known before. I was no longer just a naive girl. I was a woman caught in a web of secrets, and I would need to be stronger than I ever imagined to break free. The next few years blurred into a haze of routine and terror. Reggie's face, once full of charm and promises, gradually transformed into something unrecognizable. The man who had wooed me with stories of a bright future now looked at me with cold, calculating eyes, his smile more of a sneer than anything else. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, but one thing became abundantly clear. The man I had married was no longer the man I thought I knew. His business wasn't sales, it was something far darker. The money he brought home wasn't the result of hard work or hustle. It was dirty, tainted with the blood of people he had never cared about. I began to see the signs, small at first, but impossible to ignore. The late nights, the unmarked packages, the men who came and went, their eyes constantly scanning the street. Reggie had built his empire on fear, and I was living at the center of it. He started bringing more and more men to the house. They'd stay for hours, laughing too loud, drinking too much, and speaking in whispers when they thought I wasn't listening. I began to recognize the smell of drugs on Reggie when he came home, a mix of sweet, cloying scents that made my stomach churn. But I didn't dare ask him. That would only invite another slap, another night spent in silence and fear. I learned to stay quiet. I learned to shrink. And then, the beatings became more frequent. At first, they were small, just slaps when I stepped out of line. I believed it was just frustration, the pressures of his work spilling over into our home. But when Michael, our firstborn, was only 2, Reggie's violence escalated. It was a night like any other. I had stayed home to cook dinner, a simple meal for my family, though Reggie's tastes had become more refined. He wanted more, fancy cuts of meat, expensive wine, food that spoke of status. I couldn't afford it, but I did my best. When Reggie walked in, his face already red with anger, I could tell something had gone wrong. "What's this?" he barked, pointing at the meal I had prepared. "You call this dinner?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "I want steak, not this crap." He kicked the chair over, and my heart raced in my chest. I had seen him angry before, but this was different. There was no reason for it. No explanation. It was just another eruption of rage. I stood there, frozen, the smell of burnt potatoes in the air. My heart pounded. I was already shaking as I reached for the knife to cut the meat. But before I could even get it on the plate, he lunged at me. His fist caught me on the cheek, and I stumbled back, my head slamming against the countertop. I saw stars. Michael, only a toddler, began crying in his crib, his innocent wail piercing through the thick fog of fear that had settled in my chest. "Stop it, Reggie!" I screamed, but he was too far gone. His face twisted in fury, his hands shaking as he grabbed me by the shoulders, slamming me into the wall. "You think I'm going to let you get away with this, huh?" He spat, his breath hot against my skin. "You think you can defy me?" I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my throat constricted, and I could barely make out the words as they came out, weak and frightened. "Please stop. Don't hurt me, please." But there was no stopping him. His anger was a monster I had learned to fear, and tonight, it had broken free. The pain was sharp, but worse than that was the terror that came with it, the fear of what would come next, and the helplessness I felt in my own home. He released me only when Michael's cries turned into sobs, the sound too much for Reggie to ignore. He paused, looked over at the crib, and for a moment, his gaze softened. He dropped his hands from my shoulders and walked out, leaving me there, broken and gasping for air. Michael continued to cry, and I could do nothing but cradle him in my arms, rocking him back and forth, trying to soothe him as much as I could. But the truth was, I wasn't just trying to calm my son. I was trying to calm myself. That night, Reggie brought flowers home. He didn't apologize, he never did. He said the usual things, "I'm sorry, baby. I just had a rough day." He kissed me, his touch cold and unfeeling. But I didn't say anything. I knew better than to question him. I'd learned that much by now. But I was starting to realize something deep inside. This wasn't a marriage anymore. This wasn't a partnership. It was control. It was manipulation. And I was its prisoner. Weeks passed in this endless cycle of violence and apologies. Every time I would think it was over, it would start again. Reggie would disappear into the night, coming back with money, sometimes with bruises on his own body, sometimes with the distant look of someone who had seen too much. His business wasn't just about selling drugs, it was about power. It was about keeping people under his thumb, keeping them in fear. And I was one of his many prisoners. The more time passed, the more I saw the cracks in the illusion he had built. The shack had been a symbol of something better, a life I had been promised. But now I saw it for what it truly was, a cage. A cage built with lies, violence, and blood money. The walls I had once admired for their potential now felt like they were closing in on me. Then one day, the cracks in the facade became undeniable. I found a gun hidden in the back of the cupboard, wrapped in an old cloth. My hands trembled as I picked it up, staring at the cold steel. Reggie hadn't told me about it. He hadn't mentioned it. But I knew what it was. It was his weapon, his tool of control. And suddenly, everything became clear. Reggie wasn't just a salesman. He wasn't even a man trying to make his way in the world. He was a drug lord, a criminal who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But for me, it wasn't about that anymore. It wasn't about what he did or how much money he made. It was about survival. It was about finding a way out. That night, as I lay in bed, the gun under my pillow, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I had to get out. But how? It wasn't the first time I had contemplated leaving, but it was the first time I knew I would. There comes a moment in every woman's life when the question stops being, "Can I survive this?" and starts becoming, "What will I do to make sure I never go through this again?" For me, that moment came one dark night in 1982. It was the night I decided that the only way out wasn't through running, but through standing. Standing tall and taking back control, no matter the cost. The days blurred together after that. Every moment spent in the house felt like a suffocating reminder of the life I had fallen into. Reggie's grip on me tightened with every passing day. He was no longer just a distant figure of anger and control. He had become a full-fledged monster, someone who lived off fear, who fed on intimidation. He had built a reputation in this small neighborhood, and that reputation had become his power. And that power, I realized, was what kept me locked in this prison of my own making. I had tried to be invisible for so long. I had tried to stay quiet, to stay out of his way, to let his world spin on without me. But every time he left, every time he disappeared into the night, I could feel the weight of his absence like a shadow hanging over the house. I could feel the darkness closing in. It wasn't just the physical abuse that threatened to destroy me. It was the mental toll, the slow erosion of my will to live. I had given up on any dreams I had once had. I had lost myself in the noise of his demands, his lies, his violence. I had become a ghost in my own home. But even ghosts can wake up. The night I decided to leave was like every other, except it wasn't. Reggie had gone out again, leaving me alone in the house with the kids. Michael and Daniel were old enough to understand the silence that had become our home. They didn't ask questions anymore. They didn't need to. They had learned long ago that silence was survival. The sound of Reggie's footsteps had become their warning bell, just as it had become mine. But that night, I wasn't waiting for his return with fear and dread. I was waiting for him to never come back at all. It wasn't just the constant beatings, the threats, or the verbal abuse that made me finally snap. It was the realization that I was living my life, day after day, waiting for a man to decide whether I lived or died. It was the suffocating thought that if I didn't do something, my children would grow up in this world, in this cycle, with no escape. That was something I couldn't allow. Not for myself. Not for them. And then it happened. Reggie came home later that night, as I had expected. His movements were slow, deliberate. He had the look of someone who had been drinking, and when he walked into the house, he didn't even acknowledge me. He didn't need to. He had his power. He had control. I pretended to be busy, cleaning the same dishes I had already cleaned 3 times that day. I kept my head down, kept my movements slow, calculated, as if nothing was different. But inside, my heart was pounding in my chest. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. He sat down at the table, letting the silence hang between us like an oppressive weight. It was always like this when he was drunk, silent, dangerous, unpredictable. I knew it was only a matter of time before he started with his questions. Before he found something to accuse me of. He always did. "Where's my dinner?" he muttered, his voice thick with alcohol. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. The words were stuck in my throat. This time I wasn't going to apologize. I wasn't going to beg him to forgive me. But I could see it, the flicker of rage in his eyes, the way he clenched his fists as if preparing for a blow. I didn't care. I didn't care about any of it anymore. I was done. Done being the punching bag, done hiding from the inevitable storm. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and I knew this was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. But instead of retreating, I stepped toward him. I looked him straight in the eyes, something I had never been able to do before. Something I was terrified to do. "You're not going to hurt me anymore, Reggie," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but steady. "This is over." For a moment, everything stopped. The air in the room thickened, and I could feel his confusion. He didn't understand. He didn't expect me to fight back. He expected fear. "You're crazy," he spat, his voice full of venom. "You think you can just tell me it's over? Who the hell do you think you are?" But I stood my ground. "No, Reggie," I said, my voice stronger now. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." He moved toward me, his hand raised as if to strike, but I wasn't backing down. This time, when his fist came at me, I caught it in my hand. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me, a strength I had forgotten I had. Reggie's eyes widened in disbelief, and I could see his anger rising, but something else flickered behind his eyes. Fear. Fear that I wasn't afraid of him anymore. Fear that I might actually be serious. "I'm done," I repeated, my grip tightening. "I'm done letting you control me." And in that moment, everything changed. He pulled his hand back, his face turning a shade darker as the tension hung between us. He knew he had lost. For the first time in years, I saw him hesitate. It wasn't over yet, of course. The road ahead would be long, dangerous, and filled with more obstacles than I could count. But for the first time, I felt hope rising in my chest. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a woman who had found her voice, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me again. The night I stood up to Reggie was the first time in years I felt like a person again. I had spent so long cowering, shrinking into the shadows of his violence and manipulation, that I had forgotten what it was like to have power. That moment when I refused to let him hurt me, when I refused to let him dictate my fate, felt like reclaiming my soul. But the path to freedom was never easy, and it was far from over. I knew deep down that standing up to Reggie would come with consequences. He wasn't the type of man who took rejection lightly. In the days that followed, his anger simmered, but something was different. He watched me more closely, his eyes filled with suspicion. For the first time, he didn't seem like the man who had control over my life. He seemed like a man who was losing his grip. The first few days after that night were tense. Reggie came and went, his behavior erratic. He was unpredictable, his temper sharper than ever, but I no longer felt the crushing weight of fear when he walked through the door. It was as if a fog had lifted, and I could finally see clearly. I wasn't the helpless girl who had followed him across state lines, who had allowed him to destroy everything she once dreamed of. I was a woman who was willing to fight for herself and her children. But the fear wasn't gone. It had just shifted. Now, I fear the future. What would I do if he left? Where would I go? How would I support my children? The questions came at me like a storm, and I didn't have the answers. All I had was the resolve to keep going, to figure it out, no matter how difficult. Reggie, though, seemed to sense that something was changing. One evening, after days of silence, he came home early, his eyes bloodshot, his demeanor tense. I could smell the alcohol on him from across the room, mixed with the faint scent of something darker. I knew better than to ask about it. He didn't speak to me right away. He just sat down at the table, his hand gripping a glass of whiskey, his eyes scanning the room like he was looking for something or someone. I stood in the kitchen, watching him. I could feel the tension rising, the weight of what was coming. "You think you can just stand up to me, huh?" he finally said, breaking the silence. "You think I'm going to let you walk away from all this? You think I'm stupid?" I didn't answer him. There was no point in arguing anymore. No words would change what had already been set in motion. He slammed the glass down on the table, the ice rattling inside, and stood up, walking toward me with that familiar predatory look in his eyes. For the first time, I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I stood my ground, my heart pounding, but my feet rooted to the floor. I knew I had to stay strong, no matter what. "You're nothing without me," he spat, his breath hot on my face. "You're nobody. You can't survive without me." His words were like poison, but I didn't let them take root in my mind. I had heard them too many times before. And now, they didn't scare me. They were just words. "I'm not nothing, Reggie," I said quietly, my voice steady, though my insides trembled. "And I won't be your nothing anymore." He stopped in his tracks, staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. His gaze flickered between anger and something else, something that looked like doubt. But the moment passed quickly, and his fists clenched again. "You think you can leave me," he growled. "You think you can just walk out of this life and start over? You don't know anything about the world, Naomi. You won't make it out there. I'll make sure of that." "I don't need you," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I even realized how true they were. "And if you think I can't make it, then you don't know me at all." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the empty rooms, and for a moment, I just stood there, breathing heavily, trying to calm the storm inside me. I had done it. I stood up to him. But I knew the worst was yet to come. For the next few days, Reggie stayed out later than usual. His absence became a daily ritual, coming home in the early hours of the morning, barely speaking, collapsing into the bed beside me without even a word of acknowledgement. He was a man at war with himself, and I was just a casualty. But I wasn't the only one who felt the tension. The children were more withdrawn than ever. Michael, now 14, was growing restless. He could see what I was going through, and it was starting to weigh on him too. One night, as I was getting ready to send them to bed, Michael stopped me. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his face serious. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling just slightly. "I don't think I can keep living like this. I turned to face him, surprised by the rawness in his words. He wasn't a child anymore. He wasn't the little boy I had protected from everything. He was growing up too fast. Too fast for my heart to handle. I know, Michael, I whispered, stepping toward him. I know. But I'm going to get us out of here. I promise. We'll get out of here. All of us. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. How? How are we going to do that? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I knew that somehow I would find a way. I had to. For Michael. For Daniel. For Liam. And for me. That night, as I lay in bed beside Reggie, I made a decision. I couldn't wait for him to leave. I couldn't wait for him to walk out and never come back. I had to be the one to make the move. The plan began to form slowly, one piece at a time. I began stashing away small amounts of money, just enough to cover the basics, a place to stay, food, bus fare. I started looking for a job, anything, to get us out of here. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about breaking the chains that had held me captive for so long. The days stretched on, but I never lost sight of my goal. I had a plan now. I had a purpose. And the next time Reggie came home, I wouldn't be the woman who cowered in the corner. I would be the woman who stood up for her family. I would be the woman who walked away from the life he had forced upon me. And I wouldn't look back. The days that followed felt like a never-ending cycle of preparation and survival. Every day, I woke up with the same determination, but also the same gnawing fear. Reggie's presence in the house felt heavier than ever. It wasn't just his anger that loomed over us, it was the constant tension, the unspoken threat of what he might do next. He was watching me, waiting for me to slip up, and the fear of discovery kept me on edge. But I couldn't go back. I had seen too much, felt too much to ever return to the life I had once accepted as my fate. This was no longer just about surviving. It was about living. And for the first time in years, I felt the pull of possibility, a future that could be mine. A future where I wasn't controlled by fear, where I could protect my children and build something better. Reggie's behavior grew more erratic. The drugs took hold of him more tightly. He was no longer the man I had once known, the man who had charmed me with promises of a better life. He was a stranger now, someone I couldn't recognize, someone who only existed in fits of rage, manic energy, and self-destruction. The paranoia, the mood swings, the cruelty, all of it escalated. One night, after an especially violent altercation between us, Reggie left for one of his late-night escapades. The house felt oddly calm in his absence, but I knew it was only temporary. He would return, like always. He would come home with anger in his eyes, desperate to maintain control, to remind me of who held the power in this relationship. But I wasn't scared anymore. That night, as the hours stretched on and Reggie still hadn't come home, I sat in the quiet of the living room, alone with my thoughts. Michael and Daniel were asleep, but Liam, my youngest, had crawled into bed with me earlier, his tiny body pressed up against mine in his sleep. It was during moments like these that I found strength. My boys, who had seen far too much for their ages, were my reason for fighting, for standing tall. They were all that mattered now. Their safety, their future, that was my mission. I ran my hand through Liam's soft hair, watching his peaceful face, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to dream. I dreamed of a life away from Reggie, of days where my children could go to school without fear, of nights where I wouldn't have to listen to the sound of his footsteps coming down the hall, where I wouldn't have to worry if the next slap, the next punch, would be the one that left me unrecognizable. The moment I realized I could change our lives didn't come in a flash. It came in the quiet moments of reflection. It came with the deep understanding that the fear I had lived with for so long was a lie. The real danger wasn't him, it was my hesitation. It was my fear of taking that first step toward freedom. But as long as I let the fear dictate my actions, I would never escape. I knew now that the only way to truly break free was to stop waiting for permission. By the time Reggie returned home, the house was thick with silence. He stumbled through the door, his clothes reeking of alcohol, his eyes glazed and unfocused. He didn't speak immediately, he never did when he was like this. He just moved like a shadow, looking for trouble, waiting for something to ignite his fury. He didn't notice me at first, and for a fleeting moment, I considered leaving right then, walking out the door and never looking back. But that moment passed as quickly as it came. I knew it wasn't that simple. Reggie wasn't the type of man to let anyone walk away from him without a fight. "I'm sick of this," he muttered to himself, collapsing onto the couch. His words were slurred, his breathing shallow. I had heard this many times before. I knew what was coming. "Don't start with me, Reggie," I said quietly but firmly. He looked at me, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he processed my words. The anger in him flickered. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he growled. "You think you can just walk away?" I didn't back down. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." For a moment, the room felt frozen. His rage simmered beneath the surface, but something else was there too, something I had never seen in him before. Fear. Fear that I might actually mean what I was saying. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he spat, his hands trembling as he stood. "You think you can just walk out of this? You think you can take everything I've built? I'll make sure you regret this. I'll destroy you, Naomi. You'll see." "You've already destroyed me," I replied, my voice quiet but resolute. "You've already taken everything you could. But I'm still here. And I'm not going to let you take my children too." I stood up, feeling the gravity of the moment settle over me like a cloak. This was it. This was the breaking point. I had fought for so long, always retreating, always fearing what would happen if I pushed too far. But now I knew I had to make the push. I had to make the choice to leave, to protect my children, no matter the consequences. "You'll regret this," he snarled, stepping toward me with a menacing look in his eyes. "No," I said firmly, holding his gaze for the first time. "You're the one who's going to regret it. I'm leaving you, Reggie. And you can't stop me." The room seemed to close in around us as his anger reached its peak. His face twisted in rage, and for a second, I feared he might strike me. But I stood my ground, my heart racing, but my resolve unshaken. "You think you can leave?" he shouted. "You think you can take my kids? You'll never make it without me." But I wasn't listening to his words anymore. I was listening to my own heart, the beating of my own courage. The realization had settled deep inside me. I didn't need him. I never had. In the days that followed, everything fell into place. The money I had been secretly stashing, the plans I had made in quiet desperation, they were no longer plans. They were a reality. I had my escape route. I had my future. But even though I had made the decision, even though I was ready to leave, I knew the hardest part was still to come. I had to go. And going meant leaving behind the life I had known, leaving behind the fear and walking into the unknown. That night, I made the call to a friend in a neighboring town who would help us get away. "It's time," I whispered into the phone. "We're leaving." It was the beginning of everything. The beginning of freedom. And the beginning of a journey I could never have imagined before that moment. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Not Reggie. Not of the future. And for the first time, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I had finally made the hardest decision of my life. I was leaving. And I wasn't coming back. The day I left Reggie wasn't like the dramatic escape I had imagined for so long. There was no heroic getaway, no grand confrontation. It was a quiet, calculated departure, a movement made in silence, one that carried more weight than any loud declaration could have. I walked out that door carrying only what I could fit into a small bag, taking nothing but my children, my dignity, and the certainty that I would never look back. It happened in the early morning hours, just as the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon. Reggie was passed out on the couch, his body hunched in that familiar, unholy stupor he had come to love. He wouldn't even notice we were gone until the afternoon, and by then it wouldn't matter. I had already made up my mind. There would be no more goodbyes, no more hesitation. Just a clean break. Michael helped me load the car, his face a mixture of relief and worry. He had been my rock through this, even when he had no idea what we were really up against. Daniel, ever the protector, held Liam's hand, his grip firm but gentle as we walked out into the cold morning air. It felt surreal, like I was walking out of a dream that had tortured me for too long. As we drove away from the house, away from everything that had once been home, I didn't feel fear or regret. I felt freedom. It was raw, overwhelming, and terrifying, but it was mine. I had stepped out of the prison of Reggie's control, and I was going to create something better for my children. The road ahead was uncertain. We didn't have a plan, not one beyond survival. The first night we stayed in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was ours. It was the beginning of our new life, one where we wouldn't have to hide or cower anymore. I remember lying in that motel bed with Liam curled up beside me, his small body seeking comfort from the only place he knew, his mother's arms. I held him close, vowing silently that I would never let anything or anyone hurt him again. In the following weeks, we bounced from one temporary place to another. A cheap apartment here, a shared room with a friend there. I worked whatever odd jobs I could find, cleaning houses, washing dishes, anything to keep the roof over our heads. Every day was a battle, but it was a battle I was determined to win. The old Naomi, the one who had been silenced by fear and abuse, was gone. She had been replaced by someone stronger, someone willing to do whatever it took to protect her children. But the hardest part was not the struggle for survival. It was the constant fear that Reggie would find us, that he would show up in the middle of the night, dragging us back into his toxic web. I never let my guard down. I kept moving, never staying in one place for too long, always watching over my shoulder. Reggie had a network of contacts, and if there was one thing I knew about him, it was that he never let go of what he considered his. One day, while we were at a food pantry in a neighboring town, I met a woman named Sarah. She was about my age, but unlike me, she had managed to escape a similar situation years before. She had started over, built a life for herself and her children, and was now working at the pantry to help others in need. Her strength was palpable. It radiated from her like a beacon, and I could feel myself drawn to her in a way I hadn't felt with anyone in years. "Where are you from?" Sarah asked me as we sorted through boxes of canned goods. "You don't look like you're from around here." I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to tell her the truth. But there was something in her eyes, a softness, a kindness, that made me trust her. "I'm from Baltimore," I said quietly, avoiding her gaze. "Just trying to get by. You know how it is." She didn't say anything for a moment, and I felt the weight of my words settle in the space between us. Finally, she spoke. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," Sarah said gently. There are places here for women like you. Places that can help you build a future. And I've seen women like you make it. You're stronger than you think." Her words were simple, but they struck me like lightning. I had spent so long thinking I was the only one who had lived through such pain, such struggle. But I wasn't alone. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Over the next few weeks, Sarah helped me get connected with a local women's shelter that offered job training and housing assistance. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was the first time since leaving Reggie that I felt like we might be able to stand on our own feet. In the months that followed, things started to fall into place. Michael got a job working at a construction site, and Daniel, with his natural talent for numbers, started helping a local business owner with bookkeeping. I found a steady job at a diner, working long hours but earning enough to pay the bills. We were making it. Slowly, steadily, we were making it. But it wasn't just the work that was changing. It was us, as a family. For the first time, we were able to live without fear. We could laugh again. We could sit around the dinner table without wondering if the next fight was coming. We were rebuilding, piece by piece, and every day felt like a small victory. One afternoon, as we were unpacking some boxes in our new apartment, Michael pulled me aside. He was holding something in his hands, and his face was serious. "I found something," he said, his voice low. "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. He handed me an old envelope, its edges frayed and worn. Inside was a stack of papers, documents, receipts, and a bank statement with a sum of money that made my heart stop. "I found this hidden in the walls of the old house," Michael said, looking at me with a mix of disbelief and excitement. "It's his money, Mom. The stuff he always kept hidden. And now it's ours. We can finally use it for us." I stared at the papers, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never expected this. Never dreamed that Reggie's dirty money would one day become my ticket to freedom. But it had. And now I was holding the key to the future I had been working so hard to create for my children. I sat down, the weight of it all crashing over me. I had always thought that escaping Reggie would mean losing everything. But it wasn't true. I had found something more valuable than anything he could have given me: freedom. And with that freedom, I had the power to build a future, a better one for myself and my children. The months that followed were filled with new opportunities, challenges, and growth. We used the money wisely, investing in our future and making sure that Reggie's legacy of violence and fear would never touch us again. We grew stronger, closer, and more resilient with every passing day. In 1997, I opened my first restaurant. It was a small, modest place, but it was mine. Naomi's Kitchen was born from the ashes of everything that had tried to destroy me. And every plate I served, every meal I cooked, was a reminder that I had survived. Reggie was gone. His ghost, his memory, no longer haunted me. And in his absence, I had found myself, not the woman I once was, but a stronger, wiser version of her. I had reclaimed my life, and nothing would ever take that away. There comes a time in every life when the story is ready to be told. But not until the storm has passed, not until the dust settles and the wound has healed, just enough for you to see the scars, but not feel the ache in the same way. It's funny, isn't it? How memories work. They cling to you like shadows, sometimes so close, you think they might suffocate you. Other times, they're a little more distant, like a whisper you can't quite catch, but you know it's there, reminding you of what's been lost and what's been found. I've spent many years pretending the past wasn't a part of me. But now, as the years stack behind me like pages in a book, I realize that it wasn't the pain that defined me. It was the way I stood in the middle of it, shaking but unbroken, and chose to build something better with what was left. You see, it's not the storms that make the tree. It's the roots, how deep they grow, how they stretch toward something solid, something that won't bend. That's what I want you to remember. We don't get to choose the storms we face. Life doesn't ask if we're ready to face the thunder or the rain. It just comes, and all we can do is brace ourselves and keep going, one step after the other. And if you're still standing when it's all over, you'll find that you've built something stronger than you ever imagined. But I also know, with all my heart, that this story isn't just mine. It's yours, too. It's the story of every woman, every man, every soul who's ever felt the weight of a broken past and wondered if they'd ever be able to rise above it. So I tell you now, with the quiet strength of someone who has lived through it, you can rise. You will rise. The storm might have torn you down, but the pieces that are left can be woven into something beautiful, something you can stand tall and proud of. You are not defined by the scars. You are defined by the courage it took to keep moving forward. I've been told that the most powerful thing we can do in this life is pass on what we've learned. So, to anyone out there who feels like they're too far gone, too broken to start over, I say this: it's never too late. It may take time. It may take all of your strength, but one day, when you look up, you'll see the horizon, and it will be yours to walk into. I can't promise it won't be hard, but I can promise that the sun will rise again. And when it does, you'll realize that you are no longer just a survivor. You are a warrior, a creator, and most importantly, a beacon of hope for those still lost in the dark. Thank you for listening, for staying with me through the pages of this story. I don't know where your journey will take you, but I do know this: if you carry this story with you, if you remember the strength it takes to rebuild from the ruins, then you are part of the legacy I leave behind. Now, if my story has touched you, if it has whispered to that part of you that's still fighting to be heard, I ask you to share it. Share it with someone who might need the reminder that they are not alone. Like, comment, and subscribe, not for me, but for you, for every woman, every man, every soul out there who believes that tomorrow can be better than today. This is the part of the story where we say goodbye, but it's not an ending. It's a rebirth, a turning of the page, a promise to ourselves that we are ready for the next chapter. I'm Naomi Grace Washington, no longer bound by my past, no longer defined by what was done to me. I am what I choose to become. And so are you.